In November 2024, a 57-year-old businessman walked into a shopping mall in George, South Africa, and never walked out. Mark Lifman's assassination outside the Garden Route Mall wasn't front-page news because he owned nightclubs and horse farms. It was news because his murder marked the end of an era in Cape Town's Underworld, where three men had spent decades transforming nightclub security into a criminal empire worth millions. But here's what most people miss. By the time Lifman died, his power had already faded. The real story isn't about one assassination. It's about how three gang bosses built their kingdoms on nightclub doors, government contracts, and fear, only to watch everything collapse under the weight of murder charges, police raids, and betrayal. Ralph Stanfield was in his 20s when his uncle Colin was shot dead in 2004. Colin Stanfield had led the street branch of the 28s, one of South Africa's most notorious prison gangs, and his death left a vacuum in Cape Town's underworld. Ralph didn't wait. He stepped into leadership of the 28 Street faction, taking control of a gang structured on prison customs like initiation rites and oaths, but now run by wealthy bosses operating outside prison walls. Stanfield came from Hanover Park, a colored township where unemployment runs high and gang membership offers one of the few paths to wealth. The 28s weren't just street thugs. Under Stanfield's command, prosecutors would later allege, the gang funded itself through fraud schemes and murder-for-hire contracts. This was organized crime disguised as community leadership. By September 2023, Stanfield faced 54 charges. Police accused him of ordering the assassinations of gang boss William "Red" Stevens, housing official Wendy Kloppers, and police officer Faisal Adams, among others. But the most revealing charges came in 2025, when Stanfield, his wife Nicole, his brother Kyle, and dozens of co-accused were indicted for orchestrating a multi-million rand tender fraud scheme. Prosecutors claimed the fraud, involving housing contracts and a DA official named Malusi Bui, funneled public money into the gang's operations. The indictment ran over 100 pages and named 154 witnesses. During one court hearing, police asked for time to examine 105 bank accounts tied to Stanfield's network. Stanfield's case revealed something crucial. Modern gang bosses don't just run street operations. They infiltrate government contracts, launder money through legitimate businesses, and use corruption to protect their empires. Nafiz Modak called himself a businessman. At 44, he led the terrible West Siders, an Afrikaans street gang operating from Woodstock and Atlantis on the Cape Flats. But Modak's real business was control of nightclub security contracts, control of the drug trade inside those clubs, control of the police officers who could shut him down or look the other way. Until 2017, most of Cape Town's downtown nightclub security belonged to Mark Lifman and his partner Andre Naudet, along with their allies in the Sexy Boys gang. These contracts were lucrative. Clubs generate millions in cash every week from entry fees, bar sales, and quietly, drug sales. Whoever controlled the doors controlled access to all of it. In July 2017, tensions exploded. After a shooting at Café Caprice wounded clubbers, Modak's crew made their move. A witness testified in court that Modak's associate, Anwar Gali, working through TSG Security led by Colin Buizan, signed up nearly all the Long Street and Loop Street clubs in just 3 days. They offered bouncers higher pay and publicly claimed they would ban drugs from the venues. This was marketing. What they actually did was oust Lifman's firms and take over the narcotics trade themselves. Informants later described gangs treating club scenes as drug markets behind the velvet rope, with bouncers collecting gate fees for every transaction inside. Modak built an empire on this model. He invested in construction, real estate, and property development as fronts for laundered funds. He co-owned restaurants. He cultivated an image of legitimacy. But behind the businesses, Modak was bribing police officers. In 2025, investigators found electronic logs showing R$46,000 in transfers to a Hawks brigadier in exchange for information and protection. Modak pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 7 years in September 2025. That conviction was just one piece. Modak also faced charges for the 2019 murder of Nicholas Heerschop, the 74-year-old father of Hawks detective Nico Heerschop, in what prosecutors called a mistaken identity hit. And in October 2025, Modak's trial resumed for the highest-profile gangland murder in South Africa's recent history. the assassination of anti-gang detective Charles Kinnear in September 2020. Kinnear was gunned down in Bishop Lavis, and by 2023, police had linked the killing to Modak and the terrible West Siders. Alongside 14 co-accused, including his lieutenant Mogamot Bubbles Brown, Modak faced over 100 charges ranging from murder to money laundering. Modak's defense strategy was consistent. He claimed corrupt officers working with rival gangsters, specifically the Lifman and Buisan alliance, had framed him. In court, he insisted the Kinnear murder was orchestrated by his enemies to destroy him. Prosecutors dismissed this as deflection. The trial remains ongoing with no verdict yet reached. Mark Lifman was different. At 57, he was older, more established, and, according to experts, never an initiated gang member. He was a security magnate and nightclub entrepreneur who owned taxis, horse racing stables, fashion companies, and property. Media often called him a gang boss, but security expert Ryan Cummings pointed out that Lifman operated more as a businessman who used gang connections to secure contracts, not as a traditional underworld leader. For years, Lifman and Modak controlled Cape Town's nightclub security market. They worked with the Sexy Boys gang, led by Jerome Donkey Buisan, to maintain dominance over downtown venues. But when Modak's crew swept through in 2017, Lifman's influence started to crack. The turf war that followed wasn't just about pride, it was about millions in revenue. Lifman's businesses spanned multiple industries, and he used them to front his cash flow. Horse farms, restaurants, taxis, construction. Each business provided a legitimate cover for money that, according to investigators, came from illicit sources. Lifman was waiting trial on unrelated charges when on November 3, 2024, he walked into the Garden Route Mall in George and was shot dead. Two alleged hitmen, Johannes Jacobs and Gert Bezuidenhout, were arrested within 48 hours. What surprised observers wasn't the murder itself, it was the timing. Analysts like Cummings noted that Lifman's underworld influence had already waned by 2024. His legal troubles had eroded his power. His associate Modak was gunned down months later. The hit looked more like settling old scores than a strategic move to claim territory. No immediate turf war erupted. The underworld had already moved on. What united Stanfield, Modak, and Lifman wasn't loyalty or ideology. It was a system. Cape Town's gang economy runs on a simple principle: control the cash flow, corrupt the gatekeepers, and legitimize the profits. Nightclub security was the entry point. Whoever ran the doors could dictate who sold drugs inside, who collected protection fees, and who got cut out. Clubs became gang territory disguised as entertainment venues. But security contracts alone weren't enough. All three figures understood that lasting power required government connections. Stanfield's fraud case involved housing tenders worth tens of millions of rand. Modak's bribery conviction showed he'd paid a Hawks officer for inside information. Lifman's businesses overlapped suspiciously with underworld contracts and public sector deals. These weren't isolated acts of corruption. They were features of the system. The gangs also exploited Cape Town's socio-economic landscape. Townships like Hanover Park, Bonteheuwel, and Atlantis suffer from high unemployment and entrenched poverty. For young men growing up in these areas, gang membership offers a promise of wealth and status that few legitimate opportunities can match. The accused hitmen in Lifman's murder, for instance, were reportedly drawn into gang hierarchies through this dynamic. The bosses at the top lived in a different world, wearing suits, owning businesses, and dining with politicians. But their empires were built on the desperation of those at the bottom. This structure also created vulnerabilities. Gangs organized along tribal lines, with the Stanfield and Buisan families rooted in colored township dynasties, and Modak's terrible West Siders drawing from Afrikaans and Malay communities in Atlantis and Queels River. These divisions sometimes mirrored prison gang splits between the 26s and 28s, but local reports suggest most conflicts were driven by business competition, not race or ideology. The wars were about money, not identity. By 2023, the machine was breaking down. Stanfield's arrest in September marked the beginning. Police had been building cases for years, and when they moved hard. 54 charges, 5 murders, fraud schemes involving government officials, a witness list of 154 people. Stanfield's case was so sprawling that by January 2025, his brother and mother-in-law were added to the indictment, bringing the total accused to 29. Court hearings were repeatedly postponed. Defense lawyers argued the delays violated their clients' rights. Prosecutors countered that they needed time to sift through financial records, phone logs, and witness statements. As of July 2025, Stanfield remained in custody awaiting trial. Modack's collapse came in stages. The bribery conviction in September 2025 was the first domino, 7 years in prison. But the Kinnear murder trial, which resumed in October 2025 after a judge's illness, represents the larger threat. If convicted of orchestrating the assassination of a police detective, Modack faces life imprisonment under South African law. His co-accused, including Bubbles Brown, face the same charges. The trial is still ongoing, with defense lawyers continuing to argue that their clients have been unfairly detained for months without a verdict. Lifman never made it to trial. His assassination in November 2024 closed one chapter, but opened questions about who ordered the hit and why. The two alleged hitmen arrested at the scene are awaiting trial. Investigators have not publicly identified who paid for the killing. What's clear is that Lifman's death didn't trigger the power vacuum some expected. His influence had already faded, the clubs had moved on, the money had moved on. The Hawks, South Africa's Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, led the crackdown. Officers like Warrant Officer Katlego Mogale publicly announced charges. Undercover informants like Anwar Gali, the gangster-turned-state witness, provided testimony. In one November 2024 court hearing, Gali described how he helped Modak wrest the nightclub market from Lifman. Forensic accountants traced money through 105 bank accounts in Stanfield's network. The Criminal Assets Recovery Unit shut down dummy companies. Police gathered cell phone records, examined 14 phones linked to Stanfield's operation, and built cases brick by brick. But the process is slow. Courts have over a year of backup for complex racketeering trials. Witnesses are intimidated, evidence degrades, defense attorneys argue procedural delays violate their clients' rights, and the gangs themselves continue to operate, even as their leaders sit in jail awaiting verdicts. The trials expose how deeply gangs had penetrated South African institutions. Stanfield's fraud scheme allegedly involved a DA housing official. Modack's bribery victim was a Hawks officer. Lifman's businesses operated openly for years despite suspicions about their funding sources. The system didn't just fail to stop these men, in some cases it enabled them. The human cost is harder to quantify. Detective Charles Kinnear was murdered. Nicholas Heerschop, a 74-year-old man, was killed in a case of mistaken identity. Housing official Wendy Kloppers was shot dead. Gang boss William Red Stevens was assassinated. Police officer Faisal Adams was killed. Each murder had ripple effects. Families destroyed, communities traumatized, investigators left searching for answers. And for every high-profile killing, there were dozens of lower-level victims whose names never made headlines. The economic damage is equally severe. Nightclub owners who refused to pay protection fees were driven out of business. Legitimate security firms couldn't compete with gangs willing to use violence. Government contracts meant for housing and infrastructure were diverted into gang coffers. Public trust in institutions eroded as corruption cases unfolded in court. Cape Town's reputation as a tourist destination took a hit. And the gangs themselves? Some members are in jail, some are dead. But the structures remain. The terrible West Siders still recruit from Atlantis. The 28s still operate in Hanover Park. New bosses will rise, maybe smarter about avoiding police surveillance, maybe better at laundering money through more sophisticated fronts. The cycle continues because the underlying conditions haven't changed. Poverty, unemployment, weak institutions, and a nightclub economy generating millions in cash every week. If Lifman's influence had already waned before his murder, and Modak is sitting in jail awaiting trial, and Stanfield faces life imprisonment, who actually won the turf war? The answer is no one. Security expert Ryan Cummings suggested that by 2024 the landscape had become too fractured for any single figure to dominate. The old model, one boss, one gang, one territory, doesn't work anymore. Instead, Cape Town's Underworld has splintered into smaller factions, each controlling pieces of the market, but none holding the kind of power Lifman once wielded in the 2010s, or Modak briefly commanded after his 2017 takeover. What remains unresolved is the depth of corruption. Modak's bribery case proved that at least one senior Hawks officer was compromised. Stanfield's fraud charges suggest multiple government officials facilitated gang operations. But how far up does it go? Were these isolated cases or symptoms of systemic rot? The trials haven't answered that yet, neither have the police investigations. There's also the question of motive in some killings. Modak insists the Kinnear assassination was a setup by crooked cops working with his rivals. Prosecutors call it gang retaliation. As of late 2025, no one has confessed. Evidence is circumstantial. The case is live, meaning the truth could still shift depending on what emerges at trial. Similarly, Lifman's murder remains unexplained beyond the arrest of 2 alleged hitmen. Who paid them? Why target Lifman in 2024 when his power had already declined? The investigation continues. Defense attorneys have raised another issue: procedural fairness. Stanfield's lawyers argue that repeated delays violate their clients' rights. With 29 co-accused and 54 charges, the case has been postponed multiple times. Some fear evidence will degrade. Others worry that the sheer complexity will lead to acquittals on technicalities. The courts are trying to balance victims' rights against due process, but the outcome is uncertain. 3 men built empires on nightclub doors and government contracts. 1 was shot dead in a shopping mall. 1 sits in prison after a bribery conviction, facing a life sentence for murder. 1 awaits trial on 54 charges, including assassinations and fraud. Their rise wasn't exceptional. It was methodical. They identified cash flows, corrupted gatekeepers, and laundered profits through legitimate businesses. Their fall wasn't inevitable. It required years of police work, financial audits, and witnesses willing to testify despite the risk. What's left isn't closure. It's a landscape where the structures that enabled Lifman, Modak, and Stanfield still exist. Townships with high unemployment, nightclubs generating millions in untraceable cash, government contracts vulnerable to fraud, police departments where a bribe can buy protection. These weren't villains who operated outside society. They operated within it, exploiting systems that were already broken. The trials will eventually produce verdicts. Some defendants will go to prison, others might walk free on technicalities. But the verdicts won't answer the deeper question: what happens when the only difference between a gang boss and a businessman is which laws they're willing to break?